My name is Evelyn, I'm 68 years old, and for more than a decade I avoided the closet at the top of my attic stairs. I used to walk past it, pretending it didn't matter, but I always felt its presence pressing on me like a shadow I couldn't escape. Today, I finally stood before it again. The wood grain on the door looked older, darker somehow, and as I reached for the handle my hand trembled. The moment the door creaked open, a flood of smells rushed out, cedar, dust, and mothballs. It wasn't just the scent of storage. It was the scent of years I had tried to bury. The air felt heavy, as though it carried whispers of the sacrifices I had made and the secrets I had tried to keep quiet. The first thing I touched was a winter coat, thick wool with satin lining now frayed at the edges. It didn't look like much anymore, but I remembered the day I bought it. I had been young, working 2 jobs, stretching every penny, and convincing myself that this one piece of clothing would be proof of my determination. It kept me warm in ways no one else ever knew. I pressed the fabric to my chest, and I whispered, almost too softly to hear, would I even buy this today? The question sliced through me like a blade. That was the first ruthless trick, the one I had been avoiding for decades. Asking it brought tears before I even realized they were there. I wasn't crying over a coat. I was crying over the younger version of me who carried more weight than she should have, who believed survival meant clinging to everything she earned. In that moment, I saw clearly that the very objects I once treated as victories had become my prison. That realization nearly broke me. And yet, I knew this story had to be told, because I am not the only one who has stood in front of a closet too heavy to open. Before I go further, if this already stirs something inside you, don't just hype this video. YouTube allows you to hype 3 videos a week, and every single one helps voices like ours rise higher. So hit that hype button now, because this isn't just my story, it belongs to many of us. Let me ask you something, what would you do if the very things you once sacrificed so much for became the clutter that weighed you down? I grew up in a world where little was stretched into much, where every object in the house carried the weight of survival. As a child, I owned one winter coat. It was patched and restitched so many times that the fabric felt more like a quilt than clothing. When the cold winds of January blew through the cracks in our walls, I pulled that coat tighter and told myself it would last another season. My mother used to sit at the kitchen table with a box of handwritten recipes. She guarded those cards like they were treasure chests, because in them were the meals that kept us alive, made out of beans, rice, and whatever scraps we could afford. On Sunday evenings, the ironing board creaked under my school uniform as she pressed the wrinkles out with care, making sure I looked neat even when the fabric was worn thin. Our living room was lit by the flickering glow of a black and white television, its rabbit ear antenna wrapped in foil to catch a better signal. We didn't have much, but what we did have was treated like gold. That kind of childhood shapes you in ways you don't even realize. For me, it planted a vow deep in my bones. I told myself that when I grew up, when I had children of my own, they would never know the sting of lack. They would never stand in the cold with just one coat. They would never eat the same soup 3 nights in a row because that's all there was. They would never see their mother writing recipes on scraps of envelopes because a cookbook was too expensive. That promise became the compass of my adulthood. I worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, sometimes shifts that stretched into the night, just to keep food on the table and prove to myself that I was building a different life for my family. Every purchase became proof. A sturdy couch was not just something to sit on, it was the evidence that my children would always have a place to rest. A new set of dishes was not just about eating, it was proof that we could celebrate in ways my parents couldn't afford. Clothes hanging in the closet weren't just fabric, they were reminders that I could provide variety, choice, and dignity. Souvenirs from trips were more than trinkets, they were physical markers of memories I wanted to gift my children, moments I wanted them to carry into their own adulthood. I told myself that these objects were not clutter, they were chapters in the story of my success. Without realizing it, I was writing a second biography, not in journals or photo albums, but in furniture, clothes, receipts, and keepsakes. My sacrifices were etched into the couch cushions, my pride folded into linens, my guilt pressed into unopened boxes of items I bought but never truly needed. Even the stack of unpaid bills I held onto seemed like part of the story. They whispered of how hard I fought, how much I juggled, how deeply I tried to make life better. To me, these objects were evidence of a life built on sacrifice and love. But as the years passed, something shifted. The souvenirs that once made me smile began to collect dust, and instead of memories, they whispered of money I might have saved. The couch that had been proof of security became just another heavy piece of furniture I could hardly move. The dishes I was so proud to buy turned into stacks I didn't use. The very coat that once symbolized survival began to feel like an anchor. Slowly, I realized these weren't treasures anymore. They were chains that tied me to versions of myself that no longer existed, chains that bound me to promises I had already fulfilled, chains that grew heavier every time I told myself, I can't let this go. That was the hardest truth of all. I had confused objects with proof, things with dignity, and clutter with love. But no matter how tightly I clung to them, they could not carry my story better than I already carried it within me. And facing that truth was the beginning of freedom. Back then, life moved to the rhythm of simplicity. When a chair leg cracked, you didn't drag it to the curb, you fetched a hammer, a handful of nails, and fixed it. I remember the sound of my father tightening bolts, muttering to himself as he gave furniture another year of life. When sugar ran out, we didn't drive to the store, we knocked on the neighbor's door. There was an unspoken understanding in our street. Today it might be my mother borrowing flour, tomorrow it would be Mrs. Green asking for tea. That back and forth wasn't just about ingredients, it stitched the neighborhood together. And the television? There was one in the whole house, black and white, standing tall like a guest of honor in the living room. We gathered around it the way people now gather around their phones. One channel, maybe two if the weather was kind, and yet we felt entertained, connected, content. Now, when I walk through my home, the contrast is staggering. I see 3 coffee makers sitting on the counter, bought at different times, each one meant to be better than the last. I open a closet and find 5 coats, all heavy, all decent, but none of them worn enough to feel essential. In the kitchen cupboards, I find stacks of plates and bowls, some untouched since the day I carried them in from the store. And tucked away in corners, I stumble upon boxes, unopened boxes, that I don't even remember ordering. What was inside them that day seemed urgent, but years later, they only sit there mocking me, reminders of decisions made too quickly, money spent too carelessly, and space taken too silently. It creeps up slowly, this abundance. It doesn't arrive at once like an avalanche. It gathers piece by piece, just in case here, treat yourself, there, until one day the walls of your own home begin to close in. What once felt like provision begins to feel like suffocation. And the irony is bitter, because I thought more would equal freedom. More plates, more clothes, more souvenirs, more furniture. But instead of freedom, it gave me less room to breathe, less room to move, less room to simply be. There's a certain cruelty in the way abundance disguises itself as success. When I finally had 2 televisions, then 3, I told myself I was catching up, proving something. When I bought new curtains though the old ones still worked, I told myself it was progress. But late at night, standing alone in my crowded living room, I began to sense the truth. All these things were not serving me. They were smothering me. The duplicates, the piles, the unopened boxes, they had stolen my peace while I wasn't paying attention. Sometimes I close my eyes and remember those childhood days when one chair, one pot, one coat was enough. The house then felt lighter, not because we had less struggle, but because our things didn't own us. Now, in my present, I see clearly how quiet the theft of peace can be. It doesn't come with shouts. It comes with the rustle of plastic bags carried in from the store, the click of add to cart, the soft thud of a box placed in the corner and forgotten. Piece by piece, abundance moved into my home, and piece by piece, it moved peace out. And that realization cut deep. Somewhere along the way, I had traded stillness for stuff. I thought I was protecting myself from the hunger of my childhood, but in truth, I was starving for space, for calm, for a life not buried under piles. When I reached deeper into that closet, my hand brushed against a dress I once adored. It wasn't expensive, but it had been mine in a season when I needed beauty to remind me I was still alive. I had worn it to a gathering where I laughed louder than I usually dared, where for a few hours I forgot the weight of bills and responsibilities. Seeing it again made my breath catch. I couldn't bring myself to toss it into a bag like it was nothing. So I gave it one last night. I slipped it on, sat in my living room, and sipped tea in the quiet. My body no longer filled it the way it once had, but I whispered goodbye to the woman who did. When the sun rose, I folded that dress carefully, pressed it to my cheek, and placed it into the donation bag. That small act broke me open. I didn't expect the tears to flow the way they did, but they did. That was the second ruthless trick, learning that sometimes the only way to let go is to honor something one last time. As I continued, I felt the need to see it all laid bare. I pulled boxes down and laid objects across my bed as though I were preparing an altar. There were unpaid bills that told the story of sacrifices I made in silence. Broken jewelry that had once been gifts but later became reminders of promises that were broken too. Forgotten toys, once clutched tightly in small hands, now lying still with no child to bring them to life again. One by one, I spoke their stories aloud. My voice cracked, sometimes falling into whispers, sometimes trembling with anger. Every word felt like tearing open an old wound. It was then I realized, the clutter wasn't just in my home. The clutter was in my silence. That was the third ruthless trick, forcing myself to give words to what I had buried under piles. Then came the hardest confrontation. I pulled out my wedding dress. The lace had yellowed, the fabric fragile. I carried it carefully and stood before the mirror. I expected nostalgia, perhaps a smile. Instead, the reflection didn't show joy. It showed betrayal. My heart clenched as I remembered the vows that had been spoken, the ones that were broken, the nights I spent alone waiting for footsteps that never came. The dress felt heavier in my hands the longer I looked. My tears blurred the mirror until I could no longer see my face. Finally, I let it slip from my arms, pooling at my feet like a ghost I no longer had to hold. That was the fourth ruthless trick, realizing that not every memory deserves to be preserved in fabric. I thought I would stop there, but a wave of shame pushed me further. I pulled a chair into the middle of the room and left it empty. I imagined someone I respected sitting in it, their eyes scanning the piles around me. Would I be proud to let them see what I had kept? Would I feel light or heavy as they looked around? The answer struck me hard. No, I would not be proud. No, I would not feel light. I felt embarrassment rise hot in my chest, as though I had already been exposed. That was the fifth ruthless trick, forcing myself to see the clutter through someone else's eyes. Each trick stripped away another layer of the excuses I had told myself. The dress reminded me that goodbyes can be beautiful but painful. Speaking aloud, the stories showed me that silence is its own kind of prison. The wedding dress revealed that some memories need release, not preservation. And the empty chair forced me to see the truth. Clutter was not just personal, it was visible, and it was suffocating. I sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by piles, the echoes of my whispered goodbyes and confessions hanging in the air. My cheeks were wet, my chest sore from crying. I hadn't expected this journey to feel like battle, but it was. Each object demanded a confrontation, each trick demanded tears, and each release demanded courage I didn't know I had left. But step by step, trick by trick, I was learning that the things which once held me together were now the very things holding me back. And though the tears came freely, I began to sense a strange truth rising beneath them. The more I cried, the closer I came to freedom. Some things felt impossible to release. My fingers would curl around them as though my life depended on their weight. That's when the sixth ruthless trick revealed itself, quietly, almost like a whisper in my own mind. Instead of forcing myself to throw them away in silence, I began writing thank you notes. I kept a pad of paper nearby, and with each item I struggled over, I wrote one line of gratitude. A cracked mug, the kind that had warmed my hands through long winters when the heating barely worked, received these words: "Thank you for keeping me warm when I had no heat." The moment the words left my pen, tears filled my eyes. That little sentence freed me from guilt, because gratitude acknowledged the service the object had given. One by one, I wrote to the broken lamp that had lit my study during nights of exhaustion, to the chipped plate that had carried countless family meals, to the threadbare blanket that once calmed my crying baby. Each note was short, but each one broke me open a little more. Gratitude loosened the grip of guilt, but it also made the tears come harder. The sixth trick was ruthless in that way. It demanded not just letting go, but letting go with honesty. As I wiped my cheeks, I knew I needed boundaries. Gratitude helped me release, but if I wasn't careful, I would keep everything by convincing myself it was all sacred. That's when the seventh ruthless trick arrived, sharp and uncompromising. I allowed myself one box only, a box I began to call the box of truths. This would hold only the most sacred, irreplaceable things. Nothing more. The rule was simple, but the act of filling it nearly destroyed me. I sat on the floor, surrounded by piles, and stared at photographs, letters, tokens from trips, baby shoes, report cards. My hands trembled as I tried to decide which moments of my life deserved space. One baby photo made it into the box. Another didn't. The choice shredded me. I whispered apologies to the objects I left out, as if they could hear me. But the truth was clear, my life wasn't less because I limited myself. It was more. For the first time, I saw the value of restraint. When I finally closed the lid of the box, my hands shook. I pressed my palms against the top, feeling both the weight of loss and the lightness of release. That box of truths became not just a container of memories, but a symbol of discipline, dignity, and acceptance. I thought the hardest battles were behind me, but then came the voices of my children. They saw what I was doing and protested. "Mom, you can't give this away. These are memories. These are part of us." Their words pierced me, because part of me wanted to believe them. Part of me wanted to keep every doll, every card, every dish so they would never feel forgotten. But the eighth ruthless trick demanded courage beyond my own tears. I looked at them quietly and said, "I don't want to leave you burdens. I want to leave you freedom." My voice was steady, but my heart ached. They didn't answer right away. The silence that followed was heavier than any box, heavier than any pile I had ever carried. It was the silence of realization that what they called memories, I called chains. That night, after they left the room, I sat in the middle of the clutter and felt two timelines collide. In one, I was the young mother clinging to objects because they represented all the nights I stayed awake to keep my family afloat. In the other, I was the older woman now realizing that those same objects were robbing my children of peace in the future. The cracked mug was not just ceramic, it was cold winter survived. The baby photo was not just paper, it was proof of a life nurtured. The blanket was not just fabric, it was a mother's arms extended. And yet, none of those objects could carry the whole story. They could not hold the laughter, the sacrifices, or the endless nights of love. That story already lived in me, and now, I wanted it to live in them without being buried under boxes. The gratitude letters, the single box of truths, and the difficult conversation with my children each forced me into deeper honesty. I cried as I wrote, I cried as I chose, I cried as I spoke. But with every tear came a strange clarity. The sixth trick taught me that gratitude could free guilt. The seventh trick taught me that limits could preserve dignity. And the eighth trick taught me that love sometimes means saying no, even when it breaks your heart. In those moments, I realized that decluttering was not about things. It was about timelines, my past colliding with my present shaping my children's future. Each item I touched pulled me back into memory, but each ruthless choice pushed me forward into freedom. And though the silence of my children stung, I knew one day they would thank me for not leaving them mountains to climb through, not leaving them chained to objects that carried the weight of sacrifices they could never fully understand. The room around me was still full, but inside me, something had shifted. The clutter was no longer invisible. It had names, stories, emotions. And slowly, painfully, I was learning how to release them. There comes a point in every journey where you know there's no turning back. For me, it was the moment I stood in the center of that room, surrounded by bags already sealed, shelves already cleared, and yet one final pile still waiting. My body was tired, my eyes sore from crying, and my hands shaky from the weight of every decision I had already made. But there it was, the last collection of objects, the final mountain between me and release. I knew this was the 9th ruthless trick, the one that would demand more of me than all the others combined. I bent down, gathering the last pieces into a large black donation bag. Each item felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of years rather than ounces. I lingered over a scarf that still carried my perfume, a book with my handwriting in the margins, a pair of shoes that had seen both joy and heartbreak. My fingers lingered, reluctant, but I knew I couldn't keep circling back. I had to finish. I placed them in the bag one by one, whispering soft farewells as though I were tucking memories into bed for the last time. When the pile was gone, I gathered the edges of the bag and pulled them together. The plastic stretched, squeaked, and resisted, as if it too didn't want to close. My hands trembled as I tied the knot. It felt like I was tying off a vein, cutting the flow between past and present. The knot pulled tight, and in that simple act, I felt a finality deeper than words. It was goodbye, not just to the things, but to the version of me who clung to them. I carried the bag to the bin, each step echoing louder than the last. My chest ached. My breath came shallow. This wasn't just clutter, it was years, it was sacrifice, it was identity. The moment I lifted the lid and lowered the bag inside, the plastic crinkled against the metal. My arms shook as I let go, and then it happened, the lid slammed shut. The sound rang out, sharp, final, and cruel. At first, it crushed me. It echoed in my ears like the slamming of a door I could never open again. My tears spilled freely, hot and unrelenting. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake. I thought I had severed something I couldn't live without. But then the silence came. The silence that followed was thick, but not suffocating. It filled the room, wrapped around me, and for the first time in years, I could hear myself breathe. My shoulders lowered, my chest loosened, and I realized something profound. This silence wasn't emptiness. It was space. It was freedom. The room was lighter, but so was I. The 9th ruthless trick had taken me to the edge of despair, made me cry harder than I thought possible, but it also handed me the key to release. I stood there for a long while, staring at the closed bin, listening to the absence of clutter whispering its quiet victory. My hands were still wet from tears, but my spirit felt dry, clean, open. For the first time, I understood that freedom doesn't always arrive with trumpets or applause. Sometimes, it comes with the slam of a bin lid, the knot of a plastic bag, and the quiet afterward that tells you, you are no longer held hostage by what you couldn't let go of. That moment was both the hardest and the most liberating of the entire journey. It was the point where grief and relief held hands. The part of me that once defined herself by what she owned grieved deeply. But the part of me that longed for peace, for space, for dignity, finally exhaled. And in that exhale, I knew the truth. The 9th trick didn't just clear my home. It cleared me. The morning after I let go of that final bag, I walked into my kitchen and stopped in my tracks. For the first time in years, the counters were bare, open, breathing. I set the kettle on the stove, and as the steam began to rise, I looked around and almost didn't recognize the space. The clutter that had always sat in the corners, staring at me like unspoken accusations, was gone. I reached for my favorite mug, one of the few I had chosen to keep, and poured myself tea. The sound of the liquid filling the cup was steady, unhurried, and it filled the room with a peace I hadn't felt in decades. I carried it to the table and placed it down gently, not pushing aside piles or shifting stacks to make space. There was already space. The kitchen, once crowded with noise and weight, had become a sanctuary. As the sun lifted higher in the sky, its light poured through the window in a way I had forgotten it could. For years, shelves had been crammed with boxes, knickknacks, and the sort of things I told myself I might use one day. That morning, they stood empty. The sunlight hit them directly, bouncing off wood that hadn't seen daylight in years. It felt almost holy, as though the room itself was sighing with relief, thankful to finally breathe again. I traced the sunlight with my eyes, following it across the floor, realizing that emptiness didn't feel cold. It felt alive. Later, I stepped into my living room, and the absence of judgment was startling. For so long, I had carried the invisible weight of those piles stacked in corners, the endless magazines, the extra blankets tossed across chairs. Every time I sat down, I felt like they were watching me, whispering accusations. You're behind. You're careless. You're drowning in your own making. But that morning, the room said nothing. It simply held me, gently, as though it had been waiting all along to give me rest. I sat on the couch, placed my hands on my knees, and breathed in silence that no longer accused me. That night, I went to bed and pulled the covers over myself, bracing for the old familiar restlessness. Usually, I lay awake cataloging the unfinished tasks, the clutter waiting in the next room, the guilt pressing down on me like another blanket I didn't ask for. But instead, sleep came quickly, quietly, like a friend slipping into the room. I woke hours later with a start, not because of worry, but because my body had finally rested. The guilt was gone. The weight was gone. The clutter wasn't only out of my home, it was out of my mind. When my daughter visited a few days later, she stepped into the house and paused. Her eyes moved around the rooms, widened, and then softened. She looked at me, smiled, and whispered, "Mom, your house feels light." I had no words. I only nodded, because I felt it too. For the first time in decades, the air itself seemed lighter, as though the walls had let go of their burdens with me. And in that moment, I realized this freedom wasn't just mine. It was a gift I had given my family too, a home no longer heavy with things, but light with peace. As I look back on this journey, there are truths I cannot escape, truths that revealed themselves only when I was brave enough to sit among the tears, to stand in front of the piles, and to face the objects that carried more of my story than I realized. The first truth is this: clutter is unfinished stories. Every chipped cup, every stack of letters, every unworn dress was a sentence left hanging, a memory I hadn't fully let go of, a piece of my past still tugging on me. I thought I was protecting those stories by keeping the things, but in reality, I was refusing to let the story end. And sometimes, endings are what give the story its power. The second truth is one I resisted for years: tears don't mean weakness, they mean release. Every time I whispered goodbye to an object, every time I pressed fabric to my chest, every time I wrote a thank you note, the tears came uninvited. I tried to hold them back at first, embarrassed at how undone I felt by inanimate things. But I came to understand that those tears were not weakness. They were proof of love, proof of sacrifice, proof that I had lived deeply. And every tear I allowed to fall was one less burden I had to carry inside. The third truth may be the hardest: letting go is not betrayal, it is self-respect. For so long I believed that releasing objects meant dishonoring the memories attached to them. I thought giving away toys meant I was betraying my children's childhood, or tossing old clothes meant I was betraying the woman who wore them. But I learned that holding on too tightly dishonors me now. Respecting myself in this season of life means refusing to be crushed by the weight of things that no longer serve me. Letting go is not abandoning the past. It is honoring the present. And the fourth truth is the one that still takes my breath away: freedom waits on the other side of release. I didn't understand this at first. I thought freedom would feel loud, celebratory, like trumpets announcing a victory. But freedom slipped in quietly. It came in the silence after the bin lid slammed shut. It came in the way the sunlight touched empty shelves. It came in the whisper of my daughter's voice when she said, "Mom, your house feels light." That's when I understood, freedom doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it simply feels like peace. Now I want to turn the reflection to you. In your own home, what object would you write a goodbye letter to? What item still sits on a shelf because you're afraid that letting it go means letting part of yourself go too? And if your children, or anyone you love, opened your closet today, what story would they find waiting there? Would it be a story of love and survival, or would it be a story of weight and silence? These are not easy questions, I know. But they are the questions that lead to release. And as I close, I need you to hear me clearly. Yes, these 9 ruthless tricks made me cry at first. They tore me open, they demanded honesty, they forced me to face versions of myself I had hidden away. But they freed me at last. And that freedom is worth every tear, every knot tied on every bag, every goodbye whispered in the quiet. This is wise aging seniors. If my story touched you, don't just hype it, so YouTube knows our voices matter. Share it with a friend who needs courage to let go, someone who is standing in front of their own closet, waiting for strength. And subscribe, because after 60, our stories don't end. They finally get told.